But I believe that Palestinians have full equal rights to live here and should be able to travel and should be able to have access to every single job and opportunity like every single other Jew in this land. And that the status quo is horrible. And that Israel, as the source of power that is way more powerful than the Palestinians, has an even greater responsibility to end that suffering, to change the status quo, to change the reality.
What if we were to discover that the vast majority of Palestinians do actually want a country? Would you accept that?
No.
Welcome to Standing Up. Welcome, Rudy. It's a pleasure to have you. Many people don't know this, but we've known each other for 4 years now. We met through a social experiment. We went to East Jerusalem, and I blindfolded myself and had a sign that said, "I'm a Jew and I love you. If you love me back, give me a hug." And you were there, A, to film, but also B, to protect me, because we were scared. Going into a territory we didn't know so well, where we thought we'd be viewed as the enemy. And we were both very surprised that we got tremendous results. And it went viral. That was 4 years ago. You've been very active since then. So I want to know what you've been doing, what work you've been doing, what your activism is really all about.
Yeah, so at that time, I was at Columbia University. When I was there, I created the grassroots Israel movement, and we were into right wing, left wing, one state, two state. Our goal was to be able to talk about Israel's rights, the Jewish story, Jewish culture, and create even a movement of coexistence on campus that would show to the rest of the audience that you didn't have to be pro-Israel and anti-Palestinian or pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. You could actually find a space and a place to be pro both populations. So those are the things that I was doing on college campuses. And as I was an activist on college campuses, I started to make videos and debates of the conversations that was happening on the campus. And from there, things started to go viral. And my work more so today focuses on finding ways to combat anti-Semitism in whichever way it exists, to empower the next generation of Jews and allies to be able to narrate our story in a language through conversations that resonate with our generation. And also when it comes to Israel, finding ways to bridge the gaps between communities that are usually separated, such as the left and the right, the religious and the secular, or Israelis and Palestinians.
Awesome. So you're doing important work. And
yeah,
the first thing you said really resonates with me, because this is, I guess, a flaw I see all throughout humanity. It's zero-sum thinking. It's you're either pro or against, good versus bad, good versus evil, whatever. We've seen this duality forever, all throughout history, and it's quite easy to understand why that is, because it's just easier to understand the world when you look at things in dualistic terms, but you often miss a whole bunch of nuance, and often the middle ground is, where the magic happens. Mm-hmm. It's where we can build peace from, right? So I think it's great that you're trying to show that zero-sum thinking just isn't, it doesn't work. Have you seen any results, trying to push this narrative, the narrative you're pushing? Have you seen more and more people accepting it, that you could be pro-Israel and pro-Palestine, pro both people?
Mm. So it's a very big problem that I don't only think exists within our generation, but it's usually divide and conquer, split populations between issues that maybe individuals agree with all these issues, but we're going to split them based on importance, and that's how we control populations. When I was at Columbia, people that wanted a space to talk about Palestinian struggles, Palestinian identity, Palestinian aspirations and rights, they were told that the only space that they can exist in order to talk about those issues was a space that was anti-Israel. And they would refuse to talk about Palestinian struggles when it came to those dying in the Syrian civil war, which they've died by the hundreds of thousands, or those without full equal rights in Jordan, or those suffering on the border of Gaza and Egypt. They would never talk about those Palestinians. They would only talk about Palestinian suffering that is legitimate and exists, but only in the context of Israel, and of course taking the entire context out of it as to what happened before and what happened after. And so cherry picking an instance of Palestinian suffering and using that to portray Israel as bad. So our space, we did events where we bring in Palestinian activists and Israeli activists. We brought them together to engage in dialogue and show that you didn't have to be anti one or the other. In fact, if you're anti one of them, you're anti both of them, because there's no reality that exists in the future where both population or either population disappears. So both populations will have to find a way to come together and to create a reality together that works for both. And, I'm very much so inspired by the philosophies of Kabbalah, which believes in oneness and also a greater truth. So I have a truth, you have a truth, and the real truth is the combination of both of our truths. So whenever I talk about the issue with Israelis and Palestinians, I recognize that there is misinformation that does exist there that has to be removed, and we have to figure out how that's done. But there's an experience, there's an identity, and there's a reality that exists on the other side that I'm not a part of, and that I've also, wasn't raised knowing. Something big within the Jewish community is that we're not taught about the Palestinian narrative. We're not taught to hate Palestinians, but we're not taught about their experiences or their identities. So growing up, especially around like my early 20s, I had to really dive in and meet people and understand and learn the history about the other narrative in order to better craft my own view on the situation, which is more of a holistic view that includes also the Palestinian narrative.
Right. And I'd say that's a similarity between you and I, that we both had this evolution where we were raised with a certain narrative, and it was the pro-Israel, the Jewish narrative. And I was never taught to hate Jews, Palestinians. I was just taught that they want to kill us and that we need to fear them. I wasn't taught about their history, their suffering, their daily struggle. I knew nothing about it. I didn't care. I just thought that, they're our enemy. Mm-hmm. Is that similar to like how you viewed them growing up?
So I wasn't taught that collectively Palestinians are our enemy or collectively we must fear them. But the way I was taught is we're at war with the surrounding Arab countries. The surrounding Arab countries have sought to ethnically cleanse the Jewish population and destroy Israel several times. There are wars within Israel, whether a small conflict or a big war, every few years. And the people that are fighting us, whether it's the government or individuals that are, militants or terrorists, seeking to attack Israel, those are the people we need to fear. Those are the people that are causing the pain, but not the collective of all the Egyptians, of all the Syrians, of all the Palestinians, not the entire collective. That's the way I've always seen it, especially because I came from half Sephardic background, where my grandparents were born and raised in Morocco and Algeria. So my grandparents were born in Arab regions. And the way they expressed their relationship with the Arabs is, for the most part, they had great relations. They lived fine. They had friendships. They would come to each other's houses for dinners and everything. And in 1948, as a reaction to the creation of Israel, there was a mob that went outside of the village of Ujda, where my family was living, and massacred the Jews. And my grandparents remember that, and they haven't been back to Morocco since. They fled to France. But they always expressed to me like that was something that happened with individuals that acted upon it, but not the government. Actually, the government in Morocco was pretty much so protecting the Jews, and not the entire population, because they still had great memories and great experiences with the rest of the population. So the way I always saw the war, the conflict between Israel, the Jews, Arabs, Palestinians, was not all of us versus all of them, but more so there are those people in power there that are trying to attack and destroy us, and those are the people that we need to fear, and those are the people that we need to defend ourselves from.
So it seems you even got a slightly more nuanced upbringing than I did, but it's interesting to see that yours was through like the lens of a Sephardic Jew, and mine was through the lens of an Ashkenazi Jew. I didn't even know about the expulsion of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa until like my 20s. The narrative I knew was we got murdered in the Holocaust, that because of that we got a homeland, and we still can't live peacefully because we consistently get attacked. So it's interesting to see how Jews from different places see it in slightly different ways.
A lot of what you talk about is the concept of indigenosity. Is that how you say it?
Indigeneity.
Indigeneity. It's a tough word.
No, I think it's a clever approach. Because there's very real claims to be made that Jews are indigenous here.
But also it kind of flips the script. It turns us from oppressors to indigenous people.
Just trying to have a homeland. Mm-hmm. I think that's also not zero-sum. I think you could be indigenous and also commit atrocities, right? It could be both.
But I think it's a good narrative because it connects us with other indigenous people struggling. It strips away the narrative that we're colonizers. We're not just European colonizers. We're people returning home after so long. I think we might have a small difference in agreement for how much weight being Indigenous carries for that granting you specific rights. Maybe not, but I would like to explore that. So,
because we're indigenous to this land, what rights do you think that gives us as a population on this land?
Mm-hmm. So first, my relationship with this word came when I started, first started university. I've always seen my identity and the collective that I belong to as a population from this land, eternally connected to this land. We don't view this land as property. It's more of like our soulmate. It's where we're connected to. I often reference Avatar, the movie, where you have that, native population connected to a land. Even when they like kill an animal to eat it or to end its life because it's suffering, they sort of like say a prayer, which is kind of the same practices that Jews have, that if we, take an animal, or even when we plant trees, like you can't, every 7 years, you have to let the earth rest. We have all these practices connected fundamentally to this land. So I always viewed our relationship to the land as an indigenous relationship. I just never had that word. And then all of a sudden I heard that word connected to the Jewish people. And it was like, yeah, that is exactly what has been on my mind and what has been in my heart this entire time. I just never had the word or understood what word I could see it as. Right. And even I remember growing up, I would find a lot of commonalities with Native American culture. I grew up in Miami, and in Miami, there are also natives that were living in those regions, different tribes. And whenever we would go to a museum, I remember as a kid, I saw their culture, their connection to the land, and I really related it to my culture. And the reason why I came to that conclusion is because growing up, I was always labeled something else, the French kid, because I was born in France. So in Miami, I was the French kid. And when I'd visit family in France, I was the American cousin. I'm half Sephardic, half Ashkenazi. My grandparents were all born in different countries. So who I am or where I'm from always depended on who was asking me that question or where that question was being asked. And at 7, I went through an experience of anti-Semitism. Me and my mom and my younger brother were kicked off of a bus in London for being Jewish. And that moment was a neo-Nazi bus driver on the red tour bus of in London. He saw that we were wearing Hebrew writing on my mom's shirt, and that started a conversation. Are you Jews? Yes. And forced us off the bus.
In London?
In London.
Wow.
So that moment really shifted a lot within me, because first of all, I froze in that moment and I didn't know what to do, how to respond to it. And it made me deeply ask myself, you can't let that happen again. Next time you'd have to be prepared, both physically, intellectually, emotionally, and even ideologically, understanding the greater ideas as to why this happened. And it also taught me who I was, because I realized that this person that kicked us off for being Jews didn't ask me where I was born, didn't ask me where I grew up, didn't ask me where I lived, didn't ask me where I traveled to, what passport I had. They asked us who we were. So I understood that being a Jew was my culture and my identity that comes from thousands of years, and the other places where we're born or experienced in are just chapters along of our displacement, but not where we're actually from or who we actually are. Of course, your experiences plays into your own individual identity, but when I'm talking about identity, it's part of a collective. So at that moment, I started to reject being called French, because I'm not French. This is not my country. This is not my nation. It's just the place that I was born. And I also rejected being called American. Yes, I grew up most of my life in America. I speak English best because that's the country that I grew up in and that I went to school in. But this is not my nation. This is not my history. This is not my culture. It's an experience that I had in my displacement and who I am as a Jew. So I asked, what does that even mean to be a Jew? Because we're always told that Judaism is a religion. And if we're a religion, religions don't have rights to lands, peoples do. But if we define a religion by its definition, it's the belief system in a God, deity, book, or prophet. So if you don't believe in that God, deity, book, or prophet, you're not a part of that religion. Hence, if you reject Jesus, you're an atheist or another religion and not a Christian. If you reject the teachings of Buddha, you're not a Buddhist. And if you reject the Torah and Hashem, you're still a Jew. And in order to become a Christian, you just accept Jesus and you're a Christian. And in order to become a Jew, you have to go through years of a process to adopt an identity, a history, a culture, a value system, a language, aspirations, even the struggles that comes along with being part of that people in order to become a Jew. And then I started to understand that actually Native tribes, Native American tribes, also have ways that you can become a Native American, actually very similar to the way Jews have their conversion, where an elder, council would gather and have to approve you at the end of a whole process. And I realized that that's actually my culture. So I started to hear this word indigenous for the first time, or at least related to the Jews when I started university. And I even took a class in college at Columbia about indigenous rights. And indigenous rights means a few things. First, you're not the descendant of an invader nation. Second, your way of life and identity was born and is rooted to a specific piece of land, which you descend from the first peoples. 3, you've maintained a constant presence in that land. And 4, you self-identify as indigenous. That's what it means to be indigenous. Now, when we look at the Jewish people, we are the first civilization of this land. Our civilization is born and rooted to this land fundamentally. It doesn't matter where we are in the world. We pray toward Jerusalem. We have an aspiration of returning back home. And we collectively self-identify as indigenous. There was actually a governing body of Jews at the UN. And also we have the World Zionist Congress, which is like a Congress that represents all Jews, that voted on and passed that we collectively identify as indigenous. So to the T, we define indigenous by every single thing. The problem today is that people think that being indigenous or native means being a victim, means suffering. And this was actually a conversation that I had with my professor at Columbia, where she was like, yeah, well, the Jews aren't indigenous to Israel. And I was like, I raised my hand and I'm like, how could you say that? You defined indigeneity by these 4 things. The Jews have these 4 things. How would you say that they're not? And she kind of freaked out because she never had someone challenge her. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, it's because you have an army. And I was like, you as a Greek woman, you should know that your ancestors actually tried to fight my people, and we needed to have an army to protect us from your foreign colonizing ancestors, and we defended ourselves in order to have our own aspirations and our own things. And you said that indigenous peoples have their own rights and their own aspirations in their own way, so having an army is part of those aspirations. And she didn't have anything to say.
Right.
The extreme left seems to have an obsession with viewing things in terms of power, oppressed versus oppressor. I don't want to get too deep into this topic because we could spend hours talking about that. There is benefit to seeing things in those terms, but it's limited to how much accuracy you gain from viewing all things in terms of oppressed versus oppressor. And it seems like here's an area where you lose accuracy because she all of a sudden becomes inconsistent with what she views as indigenous because Jews have an army. I want to better understand, if we truly meet the 4 criteria. I actually don't think I don't think it's super important if we meet it or not. I look at things more in like practical terms through the lens of humanism. So even if Jews had 0 connection to this land, I would still think we had a right to live here. And I'll get into that a little bit later. I think the indigenous claim just gives a stronger claim, but I actually give more weight to what happened recently rather than what happened in the past. But the first criteria is being the first civilization here. Do we know for a fact that we were the first civilization here?
So to answer that, in our narrative, we are. And if anyone wants to go historically,
but didn't even Abraham was born in like southern Iraq?
Right. So Abraham was the founder of our civilization, but now you're referencing the Torah. There's no proof of Abraham, right? So if we're referencing the Torah and we're using the Torah as a source of information,
I don't think we should. But I thought you said from our narrative. I think our narrative being
sure. So, but if we go into that narrative, because a lot of people from the other side often say, "What about Abraham? He was born in the region of what is Iraq today." Well, there are a few answers to that. First of all, the Eretz Israel promised by God to Abraham includes regions of Iraq. And number 2, Abraham actually descended from Shemites, which came from the Levant and had moved into the regions of Iraq. So even him, although he was born there, descended from a population that was recorded in the Torah, in the source, as the first population of the land. Shem was one of the children of Noah. And he was the first man, and his descendants were the first peoples to have populated this land. Now, this is all in the Torah. It can be proven scientifically. Right. When we look at scientific evidence, the first nation, archaeologically, when you dig in the ground, in historical records of other nations, historians and everything else, you find the Jewish people are the native civilization of the land. So we actually, in the Torah, were the first people, and in science, we're the first people.
So I know that Jericho is one of the oldest inhabited cities ever. It's something like 11,000 years old. Do you think they were ancient Jews? Do you think we evolved from those people?
It could. I mean, there has to be an understanding also that there's a difference between a nomadic city and a civilization. Even within Judea, Israel, we had non-Jewish populations living in our land, and there was non-Jewish cities as well. So if there was like Shemite people without actually having, an actual civilization, it could very well be. So the Shemites were the first populations living in that land, but there was no Shemite civilization. And they kind of were like scattered all around, sort of like nomadic people in the Middle East. And the first civilization to have been created as a civilization.
How is that, whatever civilization they would have had, I'm not sure it would be so different from like a Native American civilization or an Aboriginal civilization.
Or a Jewish civilization.
Right. So I guess my concern with viewing things in these terms is because history is quite unclear.
Mm-hmm.
All it takes is for like another population to find some kind of genetic and historical connection, and then they could start claiming cities. So I only want to give indigeneity a certain amount of weight because I'm concerned at what the repercussions could be, not only for Jews, but also for Palestinians as well. Being indigenous, what rights should that grant us on this land?
So indigeneity has a right to self-determination, but self-determination is expressed in different ways. So when it comes to the Native American or Native Canadian tribes, the First Nations, they don't believe in creating a country, because in their ideology, in their identity, in their expression of who they are, they do not believe that man owns the land. They believe that actually the land owns the man. So they don't seek to create a country. So a lot of people are like, oh, well, America is on native land. What, you're going to destroy America? They're like, no, they just want access to their native reservations and to be left alone. That's what they seek to achieve. Now, when it comes to Tibetans or Jews, we have different aspirations. We actually had a civilization. We actually want a country, whether that be a state or a kingdom or whatever it exists. Back then it was a kingdom. Obviously, kingdoms today are not really in tune with our culture and the way we've evolved, but we want a civilization that is structured in our own way. So every native population, indigenous population, needs to be able to express themselves that is in tune to who they are. Now, the conversation often leads to, well, Palestinians live here, aren't they indigenous as well? And the answer to that, in my opinion, is no, because if Jews living in Saudi Arabia, let's say you had Jews living there for 500,000 years, would that make them indigenous to Saudi Arabia? And the answer is no. Just
right.
Because white South Africans living in South Africa are not indigenous to South Africa. White people in America, although they have a right to live there equally as individuals, collectively, they are not indigenous to the Americas. The Native Americans are. The Jews are. The people originally from South Africa are. So when it comes to Arabs that have poured into the land, they should have equal rights because every human being deserves equal rights no matter where they live. But their collective connection to the land is not the same collective connection as the native people, because they are the descendants of foreigners that had migrated and moved into the land through colonial migration. And their culture is Arabic. They speak Arabic. They pray towards Mecca. They have the same family names as families in Saudi Arabia and families in Egypt. They descend from this population. Now, yes, there were also a minority of Jews that were Arabized and were forcibly converted to Islam that have poured into this mix. But me and you both know that our native culture, if the mother is not Jewish, the children are not Jewish. So just because a few people a few thousand years ago were Arabized and forcibly converted does not mean that the vast majority of this population is any different in its collective and connection to Arabia. So I fully believe that Palestinians deserve full equal human rights here, and their form of aspirations are actually different than the aspiration of Jews. They care more about local control. They want their village to be controlled by their leader and not necessarily caring about this domestic control. They care less about this because this was never a reality for them. Even under the British Mandate or the Ottoman Empire or previous empires that were controlling of this land, they governed themselves locally. There would be that one family and that one family leader that would control the village. And that's how they want to live. And I think we can create a symbiosis between the way that they want to live and govern themselves and express themselves and the way Jews want to govern themselves, express themselves, and build a civilization that is one civilization without walls, not physically, not psychologically, that allows equal access, equal rights, equal resources, equal education, and allows us to be who we are living in this land.
I'm not sure I fully agree that they don't have the same collective connection to the land. It's true that it doesn't go back historically as much, but the majority of a person's connection to the land is within their own lifetime. So let's even say you're first generation Palestinian, right? Let's say, and there's not many of these, because it's been hard to move. It's been hard for a Palestinian to move back since 48, but let's just say you're first generation. You're living in the only home you've ever learned. You've only known, and you're taught in school about your deep connection to this land. That is enough psychologically to make you feel a connection to the land, probably very similar to what we feel. It's true that we could try to debate and say, but we have more history, but the psychological feeling is probably not so different. And we know that we could see this in practice by how much passion we see from the Palestinian people, how adamant they are about having their own land. So, and through struggle that becomes stronger, that feeling for wanting independence becomes stronger. And we know the Palestinian struggle didn't start in 48. It started with the Ottomans. There was Palestinians. Yeah, they weren't called Palestinians there, but the Arabs living here protested the Ottomans. They then protested the British. They then protested the Israelis. So it's true that we could try to compare, who has more connection, but in the psyche of a Palestinian compared to the psyche of an Israeli, I'm sure it's pretty similar to how we feel. And I think that's where most of the weight should be given, for how the people living here feel and how they think. Because the historical context, again, there's we don't fully know all the history, but there's also a lot of subjectivity to how important each aspect of history is. Like how much weight do we give first civilization? How much weight do we give the generations Palestinians have been here? It's not a discussion or a philosophy that is resilient or scalable, because it's so up for interpretation. So I try to look at solutions that are more, like I said, resilient and scalable, and those are ones that we could both agree on. So, when you teach Palestinians how important this land is to you, and part of the way you do that is by sharing with them the history, that can appeal to them. And we've seen this appeal to them. You and I both have had many conversations with Palestinians, and we've been able to convince them that, this land's important to us. But I don't think we could ever convince a Palestinian that we have more right to this land than them. It seems like an uphill battle, not worth fighting, and just bringing us farther away from finding common ground. I'd rather look at things, through the lens of humanism. We are all living here on this land. We all love this land. We have a history here. You have a history here. Our histories are different, but still, we all love this land. Therefore, we all have the right to live here. I feel like that's a way more unified and just scalable approach to this. Do you have any issues with viewing things that way?
Yeah, so first of all, I never talk about it in the terms of we have more, you have less, but we have a different relationship with the land and we have different aspirations. That's how I talk about it. I'm someone that's very much so against double standards, and I notice them immediately when they're put against the Jewish people, because that's a form of anti-Semitism, is holding a double standard, particularly to the Jewish people, whereas other nations, you hold them to different standards. And again, examples, if you take a Jewish population, which have spread across the world, and they tomorrow decide to identify as indigenous to that land, and are taught, like you say, in schools, and psychologically think that they are native, thus they need to take a piece of Northeast India and creating a Jewish state, and take a piece of Ethiopia and create a state, and take a piece of America and Argentina and France and Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia and Yemen and Saudi Arabia and wherever you have Jews, just because we feel like we have a right doesn't give you a right. Right? Because then tomorrow
Agreed.
You can say that there could be Bedouins and Cherkessim and Greek Orthodox and all sorts of peoples that tomorrow wake up and say, well, we believe that we're also, and thus we have a right to a land. And so I don't see rights to lands based on that argument. To me, there are two reasons made logically why there's a right to a land, to a country. One is the moral argument that you're the native civilization, thus because of that, you're the rightful owner of the land and have a right to create your civilization. Of course, any individual living in that civilization should have equal rights, should be treated normally, should feel welcome. That's how any civilization should exist. The second argument is that you're the country that exists now. There are people that say, well, China took over Tibet. They're the power that has taken over this land. Thus, because they're the ones in power, they have the right to exist. And there are people that say, no, well, Tibetans are the original population of that land and they're the native civilization. So there's two arguments. When it comes to Israel, they're both. We both have the native argument, and we also have we're the current power and control. So To me, I understand what you're saying, that psychologically Palestinians have been taught a narrative that is completely opposed to our narrative. And we have to understand that and break that down. And I'm not saying Palestinians don't have a right to this land at all. But there's a difference between individual rights and collective rights. Individual rights, individual Palestinians can own homes, can have jobs, can have properties, can be equal, can serve in the Knesset, can be in the army, can do all those things. But collectively, this collective never had self-determination on this land. This collective never had a civilization on this land. This collective never had a relationship that is indigenous to this land. They had individual relationships with territory and with property, not a collective relationship. So I understand the history of this now collective that identifies as a collective since 1964, identify as Palestinians. Sure, I have no problem with someone calling themselves Palestinian, but we have to understand and break down the reality and the facts of the history to understand the relationship of the land. And I don't think you would go and tell Saudi Arabians that a foreign group of people that live there that have equal rights are native now to Saudi Arabia, or telling the native people in South Africa that the white people are indigenous to that land, or that white Americans are indigenous to America. So I don't think it fits to say that.
I agree, but I see it slightly different because having a Jewish population within Saudi Arabia is one thing, but having the majority of a population be Palestinian. So, currently the state of Palestine is recognized by the UN and
well, they're an observer, and they're not a state because
no, they're considered a de jure sovereign state. Like that's their status by the UN in 130 countries. And, it's the UN who also gave us our status, whether we like the UN or not. You still have a situation where the majority of people on the land, the vast majority of the people in the West Bank right now are Palestinians, and they're asking for something.
Well, what are they asking for? Of course, you're not speaking for them, but in your experience, what have you heard from that community?
So it seems like Palestinians, like Jews, are not homogenous. They have a wide variety of different opinions. But the vast majority of Palestinians do want their own nation on a land where they are.
What do you mean by that?
Well,
what do you mean they want their own nation?
They want Palestine to be a country.
Well, in my opinion to that, most of them don't care about these nationalistic aspirations. They actually believe that these were imposed onto them. I mean, even the flag, the Palestinian flag, is a flag drawn by Sir Mark Sykes. That's why it's the same flag as Sudan and other countries in the region, the United Arab Emirates. It's all the same flag, just different colors and different shapes. It's the same exact flag. So this sense of nationalism, that they need borders, that they need a country, was something very much so imposed onto them. Now, a lot of Palestinians that I engage with, I'm not going to speak on behalf of them, but in my experience, that talk about creating a state, it's because, one, this is the narrative that has been fed to them. But when you dig and you're like, why do you want a state? The answer is because we want to live better. That's what they truly want. That's the bottom line. And they think the only way to get that is through the creation of a state. However, when you ask a Jew, why do you want a state? It's not to live better, because we could have gone somewhere else and lived better. It's to actually fulfill our indigenous aspirations of reviving our civilization that we're fundamentally connected to. So I think that the aspirations of Palestinians is not to create a state. It's to be able to have localized control, equal rights, access to resources, better lives, and to be a part of a civilization that treats them equally and fairly. Because look in Jordan, right? 3/5 of Jordan was part of the British Mandate of Palestine, right? And 3/5 of that is majority Palestinian. Like the majority of people in Jordan are Palestinian. Yet that is a kingdom of the Hashemite kingdom. Hashemite kingdom comes from Arabia, and the Saudi family won, which is why they called it Saudi Arabia. The Hashemite family lost and then went and now control this region. There's no movement to create a Palestinian state there. And even though they actually don't have equal rights, but you see, this conversation always happens when it's a Jewish country, when there's Jewish empowerment, when there's Jewish sovereignty. And that's a problem that I have. I'm not against the concept of a Palestinian state.
I agree that there's a double standard there. And we discussed this at the beginning that, when you see human rights abuses in Gaza, you won't hear anybody talking about it. People don't protest it. But when a Jew does something to a Palestinian, it'll be global news. So I definitely recognize the double standard, but it doesn't take away our responsibility to try to act justly.
100%.
Even though that double
I agree with that,
standard
100%.
What if we were to discover that the vast majority of Palestinians do actually want a country? Would you accept that?
No.
So why not?
Because if the vast majority of the Bedouins or the Cherkessim or the Greek Orthodox wanted a country in Israel as well, I would not accept that either. I have to be all the way through with my logic. It's not just based on what I want. It's based on actual history, facts, and truth.
But you have, a population of 3.5 million that are living on a piece of land that they've been there for, at the very least, a few generations now.
Sure.
It seems like they should have every right to self-determination.
In what way?
Well,
not at the cost of the native people's self-determination. So I'm not against the idea of a Palestinian state. I'm against the creation of a state on any native people's lands by a non-native.
So if Native Americans tomorrow were to decide that they want New York City, would you say they should get it?
Okay, so again, when it comes to Native Americans, they don't believe.
No, but if they were to.
But we have to understand specifically Native Americans, because the relationship with land and also the situation is incomparable, because they don't believe in creating countries one. There are many different nations. We are one nation. They lived on many different lands, and there were lands that were not populated by Native Americans. So one could say there was no population there and no one is native to that land. And number three, there is actually a civilization that was built on top of their native land. So there's a civilization that exists now, which brings up a question of what do we do? Do we give it back to the original people? Do we remove this people? Do we remove...
But you have a very similar situation right now.
There was no civilization built on top of Israel. It was a territory controlled by a foreign empire.
Right, but there's people that live there.
They have a right to live there. But when you're talking about why you have a right to create a country, I gave you why Israel has a right to create a country. And your reasoning to me, when you answer to me as why Palestinians have a right to create a country, is because they want it. And you don't get a right to something because you want it. Because if we apply that logic, then anybody can want it and anybody can have whatever they want.
So I think that it would be just if large populations where they're the majority can self-determine and have their own land. So for example, Catalonians, right, in Barcelona, I think that if they want to be independent from Spain, they should have the right to do that. Same with the Kurds, right? So it's
but you're talking about native peoples. Palestinians, again, are Arabs from Arabia. You're applying...
Yeah, but...
We have to compare similar things.
No, so we don't know how long Catalonians have been in that region. Like Europe has been like,
I was more so talking with the Kurds. The Kurds are an ancient civilization.
It's almost like the criteria that you go by was created in order to justify the end result.
I don't believe that.
Well, there's just so many specific rules. It's like Native Americans can't have New York because they're different.
I'm not saying they can't have New York. I'm just saying it's a different conversation.
But if they wanted New York, can they have it?
If there were a civilization that believes they need to create a civilization, a foreign empire was there, then yeah, I support every native rights to self-determination in whatever way they seek.
At what point, why should native rights get to decide for existing populations how they need to live or how they can self-determine? Like, it seems like there's a better approach, and it's to just have a compromise. Sure, we're native to this land, but there happens to be 3.5 million Palestinians living on a piece of land that we want.
They can live there with us. And you have to understand that
fine, but what if they have the state of Palestine and we could live there freely?
That would never happen, because this land is not territory for us. This land is our soulmate. You cannot share your wife. You cannot share your husband. You cannot cut your child in half. You cannot choose between these things. This relationship of a land is not just a territory that, in order to live better and have happier lives, we're just going to cut it off. It's an eternal part to us. And I think that's maybe where we differ, is because you see the land as this is historically where the Jews are. So there's a connection that we have to this land. The Jews needed a safe place, so it's great that we're here. Now we have Israel, and we can continue to live fine as long as we give them also what they want, and we can live fine. That's not the way I see the land. And I think that's where ideologically we may differ. This land does not belong to me. It belongs to my ancestors and it belongs to my descendants. It is not up to me to divide it. There's that story of King Solomon. I don't know if you've heard of this story, with the two wives that both come, the two mothers come, and they each say that this child, this baby that they're bringing is their baby. And King Solomon says, you know what, we're going to cut it in half, and you take one half and you take another half. And one mother says, sure, and the other mother says, no, it's her mother, she's the mother, take the baby. And he realizes through that the real mother is the mother that cannot cut the baby in half. And that's the relationship that I see with this.
I've never liked that analogy, because if you cut a baby in half, the baby dies. If you cut a piece of land in half, you have two pieces of land.
It dies. That's how I see it. When it comes to specifically Judea and Samaria, this is like the heartland, the cradle of Jewish civilization. Shechem, Bethlehem, Jericho, all these places are Jewish ancient cities and where Jews lived. Like even Nablus, that is called Nablus today, used to be called Shechem. The reason it's renamed to Nablus is because the Romans called it Neopolis, new city. And the Arabs, when they came into the land, they changed Neopolis, because there's no P in Arabic, to Neopolis, Nablus. So these places are fundamentally connected to us. And again, I think in the future, we probably agree on what should happen, not necessarily a specific structure of a solution, but I believe that Palestinians have full equal rights to live here and should be able to travel and should be able to have access to every single job and opportunity like every single other Jew in this land. And that the status quo is horrible. And that Israel, as the source of power that is way more powerful than the Palestinians, has an even greater responsibility to end that suffering, to change the status quo, to change the reality. So when it comes to that, I agree with. But for me, my logic is like, if we apply this here, we must apply it all across the board. If we say that anyone can have land just because they want it, then any population can have land whenever they want. If we are for Standing Rock rights for Native Americans and Tibetan rights for Tibet and Aboriginal rights for Aboriginals in Australia, then why can't we apply that same thing to the Jews?
It's very likely we just won't find common ground on this today, exactly. That's the beauty, being able to respectfully discuss differences. I think the moral argument has to do with the majority of the population and what their wants are. What I would say is, because I don't think we'll find common ground, is I do think that a more scalable approach to convincing Palestinians to allow the whole land to be Israel is not the semantic argument on, history and not demanding statehood and whatever legal status. Just Palestinians, I don't think would buy that, and most people don't buy that. But showing them that their life can actually be better in Israel, I think this is a better argument, and I think this should probably be the focus. Now, again, I'm not ideologically driven here. I happen to think Palestinians would probably have a better life if the entire land is Israel. But I'm not going to force, it's not something I would force. If Palestinians hear that argument and say, we want Palestine, I'd say, okay, that's their decision and I would accept it. Here we obviously don't see eye to eye, but I think a better argument is to just try to show them that if we do this together, if we keep this land whole, if we keep it Israel, but you still get all these rights, working together, just the land, your life will be better, our lives will be better. And I think that's really the argument that needs to be made. It seems like we need more of like a hybrid approach where native populations should get obviously something. Most native populations should be treated better than they're being treated today, but it's not that they deserve everything they want and the entire land that they want. And even you, I think you can agree somewhat, because you don't think we should get all of Greater Israel.
No, well, Greater Israel, we never had all of Greater Israel.
Well, all of the land that we used to have.
Well, you mean like parts of Jordan, which is the only thing that's remnant? I think it's up for a conversation. I'm definitely not saying we need to go and attack Jordan, but it is native land and the Jews should have a right to live there as well. Now the question is, does that become one day part of Israel? Does it not, where Jews are allowed to live? I think that's up for a conversation between the people living in Jordan and the people in Israel. But Judea and Samaria is a totally different issue. Judea and Samaria is
because of how important it is.
Of how important it is.
Okay. I think, it's something that given time, we'll think about more and we'll have more clarity.
And I think the greater truth is the truth that exists between both of us, like having a conversation here.
For sure, yeah. Yeah. I think we could move on to some other topics.
Sure.
Yeah. So I want to know what your vision for the land is, like what it looks like.
So I think the solution. All the time we hear, what's the solution? What's the plan? What is the final thing that will allow us to achieve peace? Well, first of all, I think that peace defines a temporary time in the span of time in history where two or more nations don't have incentives of fighting each other. So I don't only want peace, because peace can last 2 seconds, can last 2 days, can last 10 years. I want real justice, that we don't even feel the need to ever have any sort of war and conflict. And in order to create a solution that will have that, we have to first bring the populations together, the populations of this land, to find and build that solution together. It's a process. It's not something you will impose and you will have the answer to. It is a process to build up and to pivot and to grow together and to find that. And it has to include two things that I always talk about: solving the injustices for all, and fulfilling the aspirations for all. And for me, in my opinion, in my experiences, I don't think that solving the injustices contradicts each other's injustices, and I don't think that solving the aspirations contradicts each other's aspirations. Because in my experience with Palestinians, with many Palestinian leaders in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, and leaders of their communities, when they talk about their aspirations, they're talking more so about rights. They're talking about access to movement. They're talking about education. They're talking about resources, whether water, electricity, sewage, access to clean sewage, access to infrastructure. This is what's important to them, and localized control. If they were to have that, I do think that this concept of we need to create a state instead of Israel is removed. And I think that it allows Israel to have what it needs and allows the Palestinians to have what it needs, and we can coexist in one civilization. And that's my reality that I want to push for. That's my vision. One civilization without physical or psychological walls that allows both of us to no longer have injustices and fulfill the aspirations of what we truly need.
Sounds good. Are there any rights that that Jews would be granted that Palestinians wouldn't?
No, I do think that a theoretic example that often comes up in conversations that I have is a sort of federation plan. And the reason that's put instated is because Palestinians want more localized control, which is not a demand that Jews have, but it is very important for Palestinians. So, for example, Hebron is controlled by one, let's say, tribe of the Palestinians, one sector of the Palestinians. And they don't like Bibi Netanyahu for many reasons, but one of them is because Bibi Netanyahu made the Hebron area under the control of the Palestinian Authority, which they did not want to. Which, if we understand why, is because they don't want to be a part of something greater. They want to keep their individualized control over their local population. So these are things that are important that I didn't know originally growing up, but I've learned along the time with speaking with these people that that's what's important to them, that the Jews don't have. And what Israelis need is, we do need that state of Israel, control vision of we will have a state of Israel. That's fundamentally important to us. Is there a way to fuse those two things together? And I do think that there's a way. And one of those hypothetical solutions out there that a few people are talking about is a federation plan, where we would have, let's say, two governing bodies. Let's say you have the Knesset and another governing body. The Knesset would be the people living in Israel, so Arabs or Jews or Muslims, doesn't matter what you are. Area C, let's say, would be annexed into Israel. All of Israel would be voting for the Knesset. Area A and B would divide it into their own regions, and each region would have, let's say, a seat within this separate governing body. And they would work together in order for the state to be Jewish enough for the Jews and Palestinian enough for the Palestinians.
But they wouldn't be able to vote for the national government.
They would be able to vote for their body that represents them, that gives them more localized control, and it would not be based on who you are, but where you live. So let's say me as a Jew, I go and move to Shechem, to Nablus, I would no longer vote for the Knesset, I would now vote locally. And if a Palestinian were to go and move to Tel Aviv, they would no longer vote for there, they would vote for the Knesset. So it has nothing to do with your identity, it has all to do with where you live.
So Jews also...
It's a federation, because it would be a separate, it would be part of that same civilization, but it would have its own separation, would have more control over its security force, more control over its economy, more control over its local education. So it would have autonomy in a way, but in a way that it's still part of the collective, in a way that it still holds representation to the collective, where it's a balance of power. You can't expect that the one region here, this region will have more, control over the local region, this one would have less. Maybe this one would have more control over the greater region, and this one would have less. So it would be a balance. Now, again, this system can be flawed. I never push this as this is the solution. Right. I'm only giving it as this is a creative thing that many people have discussed and come up with that shows us that there is a way to be creative and to create a solution in the future. But we have to think outside of this paradigm of one state, two state, black, white, one versus the other. We have to be able to come together to find out what are the true problems that need to be dissected to fix, and what are the true aspirations that people on the bottom line need, and build that together. And it's a process to get there.
I agree. I think the black and white thinking, again, as we've mentioned multiple times, is flawed. You know, people often say that would never work. You know, nations are a thing. Federations are much more rare. But nations are also, you know, the concept of the nation state was created by humans. You know, we create these concepts and then we successfully implement them. So to think that we can't create a whole new system that doesn't exist, well, that's just wrong. Of course we can. Right. And it seems like the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would probably require a complex solution.
Or just creative. I think most people
creative, right?
Can't think outside of the realities that are applied with history and what they know with current reality.
It's hard to imagine what doesn't exist. Yeah. So again, I mentioned this to you earlier, but you know, I'm quite agnostic when it comes to the solution. I just look for the solution that is just, that gives all populations, you know, the opportunity for self-determination, the opportunity for liberty, right? Being able to travel wherever you want without checkpoints, and the ability to be prosperous, right? You know, just economic prosperity. And I think, you know, if those goals are met and the majority of the populations are feeling like they're getting a good deal, then I would support it. So I would support the solution you're talking about. I think we have a slight uphill battle convincing the majority of Palestinians of it, don't you?
In my experience, I don't think so. I think the thing that prevents us from being able to have those conversations is the anti-normalization and the animosity and sometimes hatred that exists between both populations. I think if you're able to break down those walls psychologically, you are able to have those conversations. And in my experience of, you know, doing many debates and many conversations with many Palestinians or other people that are interested with this issue, when I actually prefer speaking to Palestinians, even if they're anti-Israel, because for the most part, first of all, historically, culturally, genetically, we're cousins, right? And there's so much commonality in our language and our culture and the hospitality and the way we value and honor parents, like just so much in common. But when I speak to a Palestinian, I'm able to break down certain walls because they are usually able to recognize that I actually want a reality that they can exist. I acknowledge their identity, I acknowledge their suffering, and we will build that reality together. And Palestinians aren't used to that. They're not used to speaking to Israelis or Zionists or Jews or people that support Israel that include their narrative, that include their identity, that include their experiences and their suffering, and that actually engages with them and says, well, what's important to you? I might disagree with you, but I'm still it's actually important for me to hear from you. And I think when we have those conversations, we do actually find so much in common. And often the debates that I have with Palestinians start as debates and end up with like hugs. End up with an amazing experience between one another, agreements on so many different issues. So I think the problem is that we're not communicating.
We need to be able to talk, right? Yes. What do you think? What do you think we can do to get more of that dialogue going?
Well, I think what you did a few days ago with the conversation between me and Dr. Warda is a prime example of something that can, you know, change the hearts and the minds of both Israelis and Palestinians, because many Israelis also have this like prevention and walls of like wanting to engage with Palestinians. Like I made a post about the Nakba, right? And I said that there should be a day, I see the value in a day for Palestinians to remember the struggles and tragedies that they went through. However, does it have to be on the solar date that Israel declared its independence? You know, that kind of makes it seem as if your narrative or lens of understanding your suffering has to be seen through the creation of Israel. And that's not the connection. So there is a conversation to be had there, but just because I said the Nakba, all these like right-wing Jews are like, how could you say this? And they're not even actually reading what I'm saying. They're not even listening to what I'm saying.
You're just painted as like a left-wing extremist.
And then to the left, I'm the extreme right, and to the right, I'm the extreme left.
What you're doing, and you're not alone in doing it. Inon Dan Kehati is also doing this, founder of Habayit, friend of ours. You are you are showing them that, right-wing ideology can also be humanistic. And what you're doing is you're bringing in a lot of people who are on the right, who compassion for Palestinians is not important to them. You're showing them what it looks like. So I think people like you and Inon, and there's the organization Roots also, it's like settlers that are pro-peace. They're pro-coexistence.
Jews living in Judea and Samaria that are pro-peace.
What did I say?
Settlers. Which
Yeah,
is a whole... we can agree to
okay.
disagree on that one.
Yeah. I think it's important, people on the left, I guess people on both sides, they see it as like, again, very zero sum. The left views the right as enemies and the right views the left as enemies. Me, as much as we agree on, I'm definitely more left of you, left on center on most issues. But I definitely see the importance of people like you and Inon existing, because what you're doing is you guys are voices of compassion, peace amongst the right, and it's something that has generally been...
I do want to say something. Mm-hmm. I can't speak on Inon, but I, myself, as an individual, reject any references of me of right or left.
Okay.
Because I fundamentally believe that this division is what causes a lot of the pain. And I prefer talk about specific issues. So when it comes to the land, I do believe in identity and security, but when it comes to the land, I also believe in humanity and justice. So that would make me right versus left. So I just don't even see myself as right wing, as left wing.
Okay.
And
I accept that, and I'm actually similar. When somebody asks me, I say, it really depends on the issue. But I think you are perceived by most.
It depends which, because the extreme right sees me as a leftist, and the extreme left sees me
because you care about Palestinians.
But that's the thing, that the humanity that's important for me, that the justice and the level of acceptance to human beings is something that's not as important to the right. And that's why I reject the right. And to the left, the identity and relationship to the land and often security is sometimes not as important to the left. And that's why I reject the left. So I really don't believe in the right or the left.
But you are, in a sense, able to... You are having an effect on both the right and the left because of the approach you're taking. You're showing the right what compassion for Palestinians looks like, and you're showing the left what, being proud of your homeland and the right for self-determination.
And that they don't contradict.
Right, exactly. That you could live both. So I appreciate that. I think, someone reached out to me after I hosted the debate, and they were upset that I hosted you. They said you're an extremist, and that I'm giving a voice to extremists. And I told her, I said, he is actually a voice for peace. And he's speaking to people that you would never have a chance to reach, ever. Because if you are taking an extreme left stance, you cannot even communicate to the right, and vice versa. So I think you've positioned yourself, and there's a few others, and I also try to position myself this way, that we're approaching things in a way that we can speak to both people and try to bring everybody together towards a common goal.
That's the goal.
Yeah. There's a topic that I kind of want to get into, and we can make it our last topic unless you want to speak about something else, but it's a controversial one. There's a deep, deep hate for breaking the silence. Do you have issue with them?
I do.
What's your issue with them?
My issue is that so many times they've been proven to try to force people, soldiers, pay them, kind of manipulate them into saying horrible things about the IDF, take things out of context, and they're paid by people from outside sources. And it's like their goal is to be seen as good guys by this world that doesn't like Israel by throwing Israel under the bus. And using legitimate suffering that exists that has to be talked about in a way that is not constructive, that is just pouring fuel on the fire. And for me, anyone that does that on either side is wrong. I do think that we should criticize when things are wrong. Let me give you an example. I served in the Tzanchanim unit, paratroopers. A few years ago, I was on reserves, and we were right outside of Shechem of Nablus. And we had, on our first week there, one of our friends got stabbed in the face and in the back a few times. Thank God he survived. And we were looking for this individual who went and stabbed our friend. And we had to go and see, a few houses and things like that. And we were looking for this individual. I wasn't going through the houses, but I was more so securing the fields that existed over there to make sure this person wasn't there. And we had orders to tell everyone in those fields, there were olive tree fields, to leave the area. Just like in any other civilization, if you have a person that murdered someone running out, you would say, hey, go back, we're going to find him and come back out. And so I was in charge of telling the Palestinians that were taking the olives off of the tree to go back to their homes in the time that we were doing the search for this guy. Eventually we found him, everything went back to normal. And I went to the Palestinians and I told them, listen, unfortunately, there was an attack. A person stabbed our friend. He's in critical situation. We're looking for him in this region. So everyone has to go back to their homes. And when we're able to find him, everyone will be going back. Okay, no problem. And I started expressing the situation to them from a human to human perspective. Right. And an officer comes to me and is like, why are you explaining that to them?
Right.
You don't need to talk to them. Just tell them to leave. And for me, I'm like, what do you mean? If I just tell them to leave, they're going to think that I'm trying to impose on them, oppress them, hurt them. And that's not the case. I want them to stay there. But there's a situation that is dangerous that we need to solve the situation. And that is a criticism that I have of my experiences with the IDF. So you can criticize the IDF. But I think the way Breaking the Silence does it is not to criticize, but to demonize.
So we're actually in agreement here. If someone were to ask me what my issue with Breaking the Silence is, I probably would have given a similar response to that. Abuse of power exists. We both served in the West Bank, and we've seen it with our own two eyes. And it's more rampant than what most people would like to admit and what most pro-Israel supporters acknowledge, I think. It happens a lot.
I think in every civilization and any system.
For sure. There's never been a wartime where, the military whenever you have a military population overseeing a population that's not their own, abuse exists. It's never not existed, but that doesn't mean it's right. And we both acknowledge that. And the approach you took with the Palestinian, if that would be the common approach that soldiers would take, that would actually help in the process that we're trying to achieve, where it's the humanization process. It's showing that we could talk and communicate, and that, imagine if we could bring Palestinians to the point where they don't see soldiers as their enemy, they see them as just guardians of sorts, right? There's a lot of work to be done before that happens, but if every single soldier treated Palestinians with respect the way you did, the way I did when I was serving, well, then the situation would be very, very different. Now, Breaking the Silence, I have the same criticism as you do, but they are filling a void that I'm critical of Israel for not filling. Abuse exists. Israel needs to do more to stop that abuse. We could actually kill Breaking the Silence by doing it ourselves. If we would put Metzach, which is the Israeli police, in the settlements and doing work there rather than trying to catch people smoking weed, which they're doing all the time, then not only do we weaken Breaking the Silence that really is trying to demonize and not even trying to help, but we also create a situation where soldiers aren't contributing to the radicalization of the Palestinians. They could actually aid in their de-radicalization. We could create a situation like that, but it needs to come from us. And the military culture, the military conduct is very against abuse of power, but the military culture is not. So would you agree that you'd like to see some kind of Israeli institution fill that void, push out Breaking the Silence, but actually hold people accountable who abuse power?
Yeah, I think in any hierarchy, there's always going to be a form of abuse in a way or another. Power sometimes gets to people's heads and changes a person that could have originally been good. And
especially for people you fear.
Yeah, it really changes the psychology of a person. But I think you're touching on such a philosophical point that why is it that we need these things that may be negative to wake us up of a way that we can do things better in the positive. Same thing with me. Like, why did I have to go through that experience at 7 years old to wake up and realize who I was? Why did I have to hear so much rhetoric against Israel on college campuses to wake up and understand my identity and be able to explain it better? Why do we need breaking the silence in order to find the holes that do exist, that they're not doing right, but that do exist, that allows us to see in order to correct? It's almost as if everything happens for a reason, and that even the negatives, there is a positive as to why they're negative. But the question is, can we change the negatives and make them into positives? So I do think that what you're touching on with breaking the silence, that space could be, filled, and breaking the silence would be irrelevant if we were to do that. I agree. There are problems that exist and we need to solve it. And there are many problems with the Israeli government, with the rabbinate situation, with corruption, with population not really being represented, with political issues being divisive, so many different issues. But unfortunately, like, the population is not really trying to dive deep in there. Like, we're being used by, I think, politicians and separated and, not even understanding each other and alienated from each other. And when that happens, civilization collapses, because we, instead of seeing our true enemies as our enemies, not usually populations, but more so ideas or bad things as our enemies, we start seeing each other as our enemies. And so I think we need to break out of that. But I think it's a very interesting point to find the negatives and understand that they actually point out something else that exists, and through them, understanding what they are, fixing them so you no longer need them.
Agreed. Any other things you'd like to touch on?
No, I think this was a great conversation. I'm sure we can do many more.
We'll definitely do more. We'll make a thing out of it. Thank you for the work that you do, for standing up for what you believe in, and human rights is so important to you. So I commend you for that. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome work, brother.